Hey, welcome to Simply Worldbuilding. I'm Bill, the guy on the right.
I'm Tyler, the guy on the left.
In this episode, we're going to expand the same area we were sort of expanding on in the last episode. However, I think we're going to dial it back a little bit in history. We're going to try and flesh out what conflict separated these city-states, what caused them to fragment, and what are the possible outcomes of that. You kind of had the initial spark idea of like this sort of semi-amalgam of city-states, like the ones who were sort of together. So like give me a little bit of a mental image on what you were thinking of there.
So this once great nation that ended up like, and we've seen this before in real life. Think like USSR or like I think I mentioned in the previous one, like the English Empire, like any empire, they eventually crumble from one exterior thing or another
into
or
fragments.
Interior problems. And so in this case, I was thinking like, you've got this nation that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then maybe you just get a little bit, like the leaders are kind of caught up in the humdrum or whatever. They get a little bit lazy, and so you get a couple of shitty guys in a row that are in charge, and all of a sudden the people who are, on the outskirts of this empire
feel
maybe
neglected.
are exactly getting a little bit neglected, not feeling represented or something like that. And so you end up getting like one uprising that sparks another one, and it just sort of gets out of control like a wildfire.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
And so you end up getting like this sort of fracturing where it kind of kicks off rebellions in different areas, and as basically all of the cities end up having their own uprising or rebellion, it just sort of spreads like a wave from the most neglected states on like the far boundaries of the nation, and just sort of spreads in. And then this king, this emperor, whatever,
Prime Minister.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of like hands an alternative to the people who are probably better represented already by the government, more wealthy, more privileged and all that, the closer ones to the actual crown seat. So probably already have a better like quality of life and stuff.
Yeah.
Could kind of be swayed, and so he was like, oh, if you don't rebel, I'll give you a modicum basically of like your own free will. You don't have to like, be the nation anymore. You can have your own sovereignty to a level and sort of like frame it as like an alliance. So they have their own will. They get their own land, but they are now like contractually sort of amalgamized into this thing like the Holy Roman Empire or something like that. So they're like semi-autonomous states that are part of this bigger collective.
So wait, let me get this straight. So people were taking their own independence, and so to prevent people from taking their own independence, he gifted them independence.
With his own stipulations that are more beneficial than outright letting them leave. Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's just such a hilarious tactic of just like, they're like, hey, these guys get an entire cake. He's like, well, I'll give you a slice of cake if you want to stick around. They're like, you know what? Sure, I'll take it.
But if these are the people who are like closer to the center of the empire, and they've already
they feel less oppressed, and so a slice is fine.
Yeah. So they're less motivated, but are kind of like, oh, they're kind of all doing it. Like we could actually seize the moment as well, and do our own thing. And then they end up getting an offer that they're like, appeased by. They're like, okay, yeah, cool. We get our own freedom, but a little bit less free. Freedom, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that kind of convinces them to stick with us a little bit closer, so they're not like, oh, well, now we don't have to worry about making our own currency and finding a whole new, like, whatever, a way of life. It's the easy way out that
trade
still
routes
gives
can
them...
remain the same.
Yeah.
Like, there's a certain level of, like, we don't have to do the work.
Exactly.
Yeah, fair enough.
So when, you already are in a relatively easy, comfortable situation, it kind of is a little bit more appetizing than...
to take the offer.
Yeah, exactly. Than to just, like, fight for your freedom.
Yeah, totally. No, that's such an interesting
idea. That's kind of how that took shape. And, like, the borders from the map that we're going to have now are probably going to be pretty different from what they were before, because there's going to be... I'm sure that after this happened, there was probably straight up an actual war. Like, these people declared independence, and then there's an actual war with the people who stayed and the people who didn't. And so borders are going to shift over time. And then because of all of this bad blood through history, borders are going to continue to shift. So these borders are going to look pretty messy by the time we're done actually drawing them up.
Yeah.
And they're not going to look the same way that they started. But that's going to be an interesting one, because then we get to kind of explain a little bit about other ways that borders are impacted. Because we had previously mentioned that like borders tend to stick to sort of natural boundaries.
Yeah.
And that'll be kind of a chance to show off the other ways that borders do form.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's sort of the idea of it, is that you've got now these two factions, but that are also split into sub-factions, making it very, very messy and very, very delectable for people who like political intrigue and drama like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you like any of those, like The Crown, or what's that like rich British show?
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
You know the one. Anyway, if you like any of those,
yeah,
drama
perfect.
in the court, yeah, yeah, you'll like that. That's the kind of stuff that I like doing.
Yeah, totally. Then the question becomes, what caused this? Because I like to think it was some sort of disaster of some kind.
Yeah.
I think maybe a disaster of some kind that maybe even just brought into question the ability for this empire they were part of to protect them.
Yeah. So a handful of things that come to mind immediately.
Yeah.
Are being that they are on the outskirts of this civilization already. You're going to have kind of like the slow wear and tear, the frustration of things like they're going to be kind of second class in terms of like, you know, tax breaks, or like in times of food shortages, they're going to start kind of sending the food outwards, and there's going to be less and less for the people on the outskirts. So there's going to be a lot of things that kind of wear them down over time. But then you also have this giant thrumming pool of energy that is spawning and spitting out these monsters.
Yeah.
And so now they're also getting the least from their government, but are at the forefront of all the actual like work and pressure and danger.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of, my mind jumped right to, that was sort of the snapping point. Like maybe there was just like a particularly rough year of like incursions from these horrible monsters, and they're like, yeah, fuck this. Like we can do better. Like if we're able to already protect ourselves, then we would do better
not being taxed.
Exactly, not to be taxed. Exactly, yeah. If we seize the means of our production.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
No, that totally does make a lot of sense. Even if it wasn't just like a specific year, but it was just something that ramped up. Like it would be sort of something that like in history that... Because I'm assuming it's just from the forefront of, again, this sort of, this magical amplification zone where, yeah, like it just got bad. But I like to think it wasn't just 1 year. Because I feel like if it was 1 year, people would be like, oh man, last year sucked. 2020, man. If it was something that progressed to the point where it seemed like it wasn't going to stop, like it was something like maybe they refer to as like before the amplification or something like that, just again using kind of the terminology we have been, and then maybe it has died down by now, but history's happened at that point. But yeah, so I guess probably the best idea is just they started being just raided and overtaken.
So hear me out. You've got already all of these like slow burn things that are pissing them off and disenfranchising them from their government.
Yeah.
And then you also have a steadily increasing amount of risk from, you know, this portal, this thing that's creating these entities. Yeah. And then also, what if at the same time they're like now kind of getting like word from this central authority that like, oh, we're having like a draft now because of something that is not really relevant to them. Maybe there's one uprising or something like that. Some like petty, just little thing, and they're like, we're gonna start drafting everybody so you can come fight our wars, our battles. And they're like, we have way too much shit to deal with already. And that's kind of like a snap to them. It's like, they're like, okay, now give me all of your people ages 13 to 25 or whatever. Like, bring them down here so that we can do stuff. Yeah. And then all of those people 13 to 25 are like, I'm not leaving my mom to die to these monsters because you want to go extract the taxes from like some far off distant land or something like that.
Hear me out. What if the conflict that caused that that draft to happen was the triplet cities choosing to try and become independent from the empire first.
I like it. Beautiful.
And then, so they were trying to draft for that conflict, which caused the other side of the nation to become completely disenfranchised.
Yeah, totally.
And so it separated into these three factions: the one that wanted to become independent because it thought it was powerful enough in the first place, the ones that were sick of their shit, and the guys in the middle.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's perfect.
Fuck yeah.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's yeah, it was just a fucking spark. It worked out perfectly. So yeah, they were sort of being which would also kind of hear me out though.
Yeah.
So it's, if we're calling it for now, like the amplification, because we were also talking about the fact that this affects the land around it. So what if, like, on the map previously, like if we had an earlier map and then a later map, what if, like, the sort of the wilds of amplification expanded? There used to be more of this empire, and it covered more of this country, but during the time of the amplification, they just got completely destroyed. Like, it was eating away at the borders of the empire to the point where maybe we just have what's remaining now. Bust out the map.
Take a quick peek at it.
Yeah, just so we have a little bit of reference here.
If we are assuming that the borders are kind of more or less gonna end around here, how much impact are we thinking from, like, this guy up here?
Well, I'm thinking it didn't even reach the coast. It probably just had a central area here.
And
just
so,
right around, like, whatever the amplification entity is.
Okay.
And then after, like, it just had a moment where it surged. And it ate
yeah.
away at not only this empire, but also, like, the surrounding area as well.
Okay, yeah, I like it. Because we were also thinking that area is going to be kind of like, a lot of it is going to be reclaimed land and then amplified land and stuff as well. So what if, there was some further boundaries, maybe not a whole lot, but then, like, when this thing, like, sets off this burst, it just, like, leveled a certain, like, radius of, like, buildings, and then has, like, since been kind of reclaimed as well. But just leveled, like, you know, enough, like, towns and villages that also was like, this is enough. This is enough. Like, this is a clear, consistent problem that is getting worse. You're drafting us to go fight in a war that we don't care about. And you've never done a damn thing for us to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I'd be pissed, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's sort of a cool idea in tying into a few previous things as well. Because we were thinking, not only are these guys collecting beasts that have showed up basically at their doorstep as well, and they're using to their advantage, but we were also thinking that there's probably going to be people who take expeditions in order to see what the hell happens, and probably don't come back, or come back with something incredibly valuable. And so it would be kind of interesting, just again thinking from a player standpoint, if you were just drafted to be part of one of these expedition parties, the fact that you wouldn't just be exploring jungle or tundra or some sort of crazy biome, but the first layers are ruins. They're pieces of the old civilization that's sort of been eaten away at this point. And that's part of it as well. You're also, like, not only trying to discover what the sort of the amplification wilds have to offer, but also reclaiming golden riches that they whatever's left as well. And so that can lead to a lot of really interesting locations. Just a fort that's been taken over and now is the home of a hydra or something like that. Like, there's just so much you can do with that.
So what I was thinking also is that, like, we've already talked about how the landscape that is sort of closer and closer to whatever this, like, rift or portal or whatever is amplified. So, like, you know, if it's a forest, then all of a sudden, like, maybe it's sort of morphed into this extremely accentuated forest.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe some of the like, bits of old civilization that are kind of closer have also kind of morphed in their own way as well.
Interesting. Yeah, that's kind of a cool idea as well. Like, yeah, maybe it was sort of a fort, but also maybe the stone around it has sort of morphed in a way that starts to continue. That's a freaking crazy idea. Like, they're just a small castle, a fort, stone walls. They have, like, just what you think of a fort from freaking Skyrim. But, like, the natural landscape has started to mimic the fort or something like that because it's such a central piece. That could be an interesting idea as well. But yeah, there's so much you could do with that, and I do kind of like the idea that the reason these people are so adamant about like using or destroying the amplification and the wilds there is just because of the history they have with it.
Yeah.
It's sort of, some of them have chosen to try and beat them, some of them have chosen to try and join them a little bit, and it's created this interesting history that also means they don't like the Empire in the middle.
Yeah, and so the Empire being in the middle is also such an interesting thing to me, because you've got like these three triplets on the other side, on the I guess that's the eastern side, that are very, very powerful, very distinct, and work together as well. And then you have on the farther west side, honestly in kind of a tough position, because they're squeezed between sort of the central power that is like the throne, the crown, and the stark desert, and then this crazy amplified wilds. Like it puts everybody in a really tough position, because the people who might be sympathetic to the other people who left the crown are now blocked via the people that are still loyal in the center, and vice versa. And then also looking at the map, they didn't really have they had a small window where, I mean, we haven't really drawn up the borders or anything like that yet, but where they are going to have only a small bit of access to the sea, whereas like the loyalists are probably going to have a little bit more access to the sea, but they're also kind of assholes, and probably may not have the best relationship with people, and so like a lot of the trade is kind of wasted on those guys. And then you have the ports of the triplet cities that are a little bit more accessible for trade, and maybe they only have a small little bit of like safe land where they can kind of trade through if they're on good terms with those people at that time, before you're like risking sending your trade lines through this amplified wild to use the ports of the triplet cities, and vice versa.
They're under a lot of problems, and I think the ones who are bordering the desert and the wilds, this almost also gives them more reason to be separated from each other, and because again it's like, oh well, why don't you guys just band together? But it's like, this is the thing, is they're under a lot of stress for a lot of reasons, which will just cause conflict in general. Like, this works on a micro and a macro scale. If you consider the fact that it's like, if you lock 5 people in a house, there's going to be alliances made, certain people are going to be warring with each other, assuming it's not just a family. Even in a family, it'll happen, absolutely. But then, you blow it up to a city, state, or country-sized scale, they're isolated on almost all fronts, and so they're just trapped with each other. Chaos is going to ensue, and so it does kind of give a realistic reason why they're also kind of just like fragmented constantly.
Well, because it's also like there's a lot of difference in what each of those things struggles with and what they have at their disposal. Because like if you look at like the city-state that's kind of pushed right up to the Badlands, they're gonna have very, very different needs than what somebody pushed inland right up against the border of their enemy in the loyalist state is gonna have very, very different needs from what somebody up in the the more northern stretch that's like right back to back with the wilds and these creatures. They have very, very different needs, and so one central government is gonna have a hell of a time actually solving all of those individual problems, and so they need their own like local government to actually sort of solve their problems with what they have.
Exactly.
Honestly, not to make this about Canada again, but we kind of have a similar problem in that, like, being on the far, far west coast, we are so far away from the east coast. We have different problems, and so a lot of times, like, the things that need doing here and here, very different. And you've got an extremely amplified version of that with like in the map here, where you have such drastic, stark problems, and then up here you have just as bad problems, but they're different. So you can't have one person fixing both of those because they're so different.
And as well as the fact that like a separation is, at least in maybe not the recent history, but like it's in the history of these people's existence, and so unifying under a single government probably doesn't sound very good to them. Appealing, they're like, I just got out of that guy's freaking country. I don't want to, like, I would rather keep it to someone who I can hold accountable and understands our needs. And so it's cool because it geographically makes sense why they would fragment. Even outside of the war that they had previously. So I really love that. So we have this sort of amplification that ended up happening. Do you think most of the beasts that they've either allied with or killed and have begun to use came from that amplification?
I think that maybe some, like, I think that like a handful of like big powerful ones maybe were created because of this like burst, whatever it was, but that kind of also was like, let's say you've got like a clay pot and that's like, there was a trickle before and then it cracked and there was a big burst,
yeah,
but now the hole is also bigger,
yeah,
so it's just gotten more serious. There's more water, there's more of these creatures coming through this thing than there were before, but it wasn't necessarily like that's where they were all created. It was like there was a burst, and then there's now also a higher steady flow than there was before.
I kind of like to think that it's the floodgates sort of opening.
Yeah.
Like they initially had a small amount and now it's a big amount. But we were also talking about like a certain amount of this land was claimed. Like there was thousands of people probably killed in the process. Lots of land was taken from them. I think especially if the amplification happened and hasn't necessarily stopped, it's probably the reason they probably survived is because they chose to use the beasts against them or ally with them. Like, again, it's a can't beat them, join them sort of scenario, or we beat them, so let's continue with that that process. But it became amplified. They didn't know what to do. They were receiving very little military help. Or even if they were receiving a decent amount, the amplification continued and they just kept getting beat back until someone had the idea, what if we use this to our advantage?
Yeah, and I personally think that this probably like accelerated their need and desire to harness these creatures, because like beforehand, when it was all a single nation, they weren't really getting any help. They were managing, but then when this burst came and sort of unleashed like even more powerful ones, and they sort of like slugged through it, but then we're like, we need to get our shit going, because now they're separate states and they're able to kind of like take these into their own power rather than like previously if they had killed one, it probably just goes to the throne if there's anything beneficial to use there. So now that they have this like their own freedom to claim these things, that's when they really went hard into like, okay, let's get this, let's use it, and let's keep getting more like exponentially, right?
Yeah, and I think that's probably how like the border to the wilds has been maintained, in the fact that each of these places, because this was a crisis, and so like even the ability to disperse information from the center of the empire, let alone to each other, was probably very little. Like 2 towns are taken away by this, and you don't hear about that miles down the road until like a long time later. And so this would also sort of create their independence as well, because communication between them would be lost because the effort to do it would be non-beneficial. And so they each developed their own means. There was the innumerable maw, where they managed to kill this crazy shark or whatever it is.
And now they've got better weapons.
Now they've got these weapons
themselves.
that actually work against these beasts, and they managed to push back and have held it back. Same thing with the mountain crab. Like the beast just picked them up and it hasn't killed them.
Kind of working.
And they're just and so like even if other beasts tried to attack the city, for the most part they're like, yeah, they have the higher ground. And then same thing with the telepathic one. Like that would almost tricked them into doing it. I like to think that maybe it was sort of the first one. Maybe they developed this.
Sorry, not to interrupt your idea thought here, but that probably is going to be more than likely the one right on the outer fringes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so maybe this was like one of the things that was caused by like this crazy burst. Is like this one came out along with a bunch of other ones that it was kind of like leading or something like that, right? And then they managed to finally take it down, and then kind of got that power to hold the rest at bay a little bit easier as well.
Oh yeah, maybe this one, whether it knew it or not, was sort of leading other ones to it. I can't see the innumerable maw being one of those, just because of its aquatic in nature. And then the crab, I feel like that one almost sprouted from where it was. But we can, like, when we come up with a few other ones, maybe there was a small pack of these things, and that might have been a leading factor in just like, again, the wilds taking over so quickly. Like they took they managed to take down basically the linchpin in that whole scenario. The other ones kind of were released from its telepathy, and yeah, they started to just flail about, but then people saw like, oh, these things can be killed, and each little group, again, a single city decides, we're taking on that one. It's now or never. We're gonna die if we don't take it. So yeah, that's definitely a cool idea, is that maybe this thing did draw a whole bunch of them out to the fringe as well. No, I like that too.
I will say, on the flip side, do you think that the more loyalist city-states, they're kind of cut off, at least from the majority of this, like, wilderness? Like, they have all of the other, like, separatist nations sort of blocking their access. I can see how previously, when they were one, they would have been able to kind of hoard this resource before, but now they don't really have the same level of access. Do you think that they still really care to keep skin in the game? Do you think that this is a constant thing where they're like, you know, maybe there's one of the fringe city-states that they just continuously keep disrespecting their borders to send people through and bring back things? Do you think that they care at all? Do you think that they're like, nah, we're strong enough anyway, let these guys handle the bullshit monsters, we don't want anything to do with that?
I mean, it might just be an area where those sorts of monsters don't necessarily spread out nearly as much.
I don't think that they'll really be bothered by it nearly as much, because they have to straight up go through the other ones to get there.
Yeah.
But do you think that because they will have known the power that comes with defeating these things or harnessing these things, that they were willing to let it go? Do you think that they don't really have a choice because the other ones are strong enough to be able to keep at least small levels of like conflict handled? Like, and maybe not all of these loyalist city-states are really that organized where they can actually agree and put up a fight, or if they did, then all the other like democratic nation states or separatist nation states would maybe actually put aside their beef and defend them. Like,
how's this gonna work, basically?
Do you think that they are worried enough about it where they want to keep some skin in the game, or are they kind of just shut out of the game now enough where they've decided to shift and do their own thing? Because they probably still do have some level of a stockpile as well.
Okay, so hear me out. I had a little bit of a thought process while you were talking about it. So I initially thought, and this could even still be kind of a thing, but assuming back when they were a singular nation, this could have been another bit of a cultural divide, just generally, like, just among the people, is the fact that the people on the outskirts could have been considered low income, even savage in a way, because they're the ones dealing with all of this stuff. And so the people within have the privilege of never having to deal with that, and so don't understand. They can't relate. They're like, why are you guys having such a big problem? The Empire's fantastic. It defends us well. We have massive armies. What's the problem? You guys can't get it through your heads.
They've been too busy going to post-secondary school, whereas all the people on the fringe outsides have been fighting for their lives.
Yeah, exactly. And so there may have been that fracture there, and so that was sort of the first thing. But as an empire, and especially since you had a literal revolt on a mass scale, the leadership would be scared shitless, regardless of the cultural differences between the inside and the fringe. So what does that mean? They would absolutely want the power that comes with that. But this isn't the amplification wilds aren't the only place you can find these things. And one thing that we mentioned is that only a small amount of the fringe city-states actually have access to the ocean. And so what that makes me think is they're not going to the amplification wilds in order to actually pick up these things. They're going to the ocean because that's the only place they have access to. And so maybe the ones similar to the shark are ones that they very heavily rely on. You see what I mean?
Bringing the map back from
map back,
because I was also thinking that being that is going to be like, they might have troubles doing it, but they could in theory also sail around and come at this thing from another side as well.
Maybe they do. They probably have a strong navy, being a coastal place in the first place, although that would be an expensive trip.
Yeah, a very big deal.
But what they would probably, I mean, I can't say it wouldn't be a thing. Like, just look at England and all the other places traveling to the New World. It was a fucking expensive trip.
But they did it.
Lots of people died because they
brought back resources and stuff.
Resources were important
for them.
And so I think they probably can't. They're not breaking the borders constantly. They're not doing that because it's a conflict waiting to happen that they like we established, were really afraid of happening in the first place. So probably what they're doing is relying on their access to these things via the ocean, and probably, like you said, using very expensive expeditions. If they are going to try and find one, they're sending it, and so they have much slower access,
fleets
but they're
of
doing
warships going out, and then maybe they come back and they actually successfully hunted 3, and it takes up like the entire deck of some of these ships. Maybe some of these ships are basically like freighters, like they'll just like tow them behind the other ships, and they just got like blank decks so that they can put these things on them. But it does give them access to it, slower, more expensive, but a little bit more safe, because they also now don't have to worry about defending their borders from it, because they've got these other bozos, right? To sort of
I don't think the ocean's going to be much safer, though, at the same time.
That's fair enough.
Like, you've seen Jaws. Like, there's plenty of fish in the sea. There's always a bigger fish. But yeah, so it is more expensive for them, but also to that point, they're still an empire. They still probably have an economic wealth that the original city-states didn't have, because they are city-states, but again, they're like, well, you're still part of us, so we still have this little amount of tax. Like, they're going to accrue more wealth, absolutely. Sure. And also, again, coastal city trade. They probably trade with Sim Valley very consistently. And so there's a bit of a beneficial relationship. They have the money, so they do it. But so that's how I see that happening. I don't see them crossing. I see them using what they have.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that kind of comes up with that. And I am going to be absolutely stoked to come up with more crazy ocean creatures, because that's my favorite thing to do ever. Just a personal note. I think I've mentioned this before, but deep sea wildlife and deep sea monsters are my favorite thing in the entire freaking world. And so, yeah, we'll have to, I can't think of any right now that aren't just like something like, oh, giant octopus, giant this, giant that.
Clam.
Yeah, giant clam. That would be so funny. But yeah, we can come up with a bunch of these.
Giant barnacle.
Like, what do we do about this thing? We can't move it.
That scraped my finger really bad. But yeah, so I do think that, like, you know, the capital that is still like by far the most wealthy out of any. I do think that in exchange for granting them this freedom, that they do kind of have, like, you know, a stipend. Like they've got some sort of like payment and like military obligation of some level, but they do kind of still extract like heavily taxes from these people, because they're still a part of, like, you know, the expanded empire, this alliance thing. And so they do still have sort of the benefit of having them all together, and so they can kind of, at least to a level, coordinate some stuff like that. But I do imagine also the capital being like, because it was like always just the capital, and so they're like, let's make it opulent, let's make it wealthy. It's just like palatial. Like it's large, it's very wealthy, and they might not have a whole lot in the way of things like farms, because they didn't really need that before. They left that to the suburbs, right, before the other cities. And so they do kind of also rely on these people. But I think that also those people probably, to an extent, also know that, because I don't picture these cities
just bending over for them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't think that they always agree and always get along and always go willy-nilly do whatever they're told.
Reiteration, these are independent city-states under an umbrella. And so, yeah, you do have to, like, kind of remember that. It's like, okay, there's probably a certain amount of taxes. So, drafting might still be a thing. But almost all other functionality is left up to them.
But all in all, like, sort of towing the line and listening to at least the most basic things like paying your taxes or whatever, like, yeah, we hate it, but is it worth now having to fight the rest of, like, the loyalist nations to leave? You know, is it really worth it? No. So we'll do what we have to, and no more.
And well, and I do like how that kind of ties into the original tension between the Fringes and them, is the fact that they're like, again, they had this sort of privilege that they didn't have to fight all these creatures. They're not having to defend themselves so consistently, and so they've become comfortable. And so the idea of fighting, these guys are like the guys on the Fringe. They're like, the Empire's the last thing we have to worry about right now. We know how to fight these things. We can fight you. But the people on the inside who don't have to fight very consistently, decided a bit of the lazier route. They're like, okay, well, we'll take, again, a little piece of the pie in exchange for not having
to fight to the death for it.
Exactly.
And also now they don't have the momentum to, like, before when everybody is uprising all at once, it's very easy to throw your hat into that pile, right? And be like, I'm in. But now that everything is kind of like the dust has settled, they can't really like
respark it,
weasel their way out of it because they don't have backup anymore. So you're not going to rely on the goodwill of these people that you know, to your east, like, that have already revolted. You're not going to rely on their goodwill because you've been their enemy since then. So it's going to be just you versus the rest of them. So you're probably not really willing to do that.
Absolutely. So it's such a it's all fallen into place very well. The other thing I do kind of want to touch on, at least briefly, is the city-states. They were the first ones to decide to try and become independent of this empire. Why?
Sorry, the city-states or the...
the triplet cities.
Yeah. I mean, we've discussed the fact that they kind of, like, already were a little bit disenfranchised in the way that they had very distinct cultures and religions as well. They were far enough, like, geographically, where they were at the outskirts, and they didn't have the same, like, pressure necessarily the other ones did. But they're kind of gonna almost be on the flip side, where they are significantly different, but they're also well enough, like, left on their own that they can function, and so now they're, like, paying higher taxes or whatever that seem useless. You know what I mean? Like, the three of them are doing completely fine all by themselves, and probably worked out some kind of agreement to, like, hey, like, let's just leave this whole thing behind because what is it doing for us, right? And not in the same way that the other ones were, because they had, like, all the pressure of, like, actually a fight to the death all the time. Whereas these ones are probably more like, we're just better off by ourselves. Do you want to, like...
They moved out of their parents' house.
Exactly.
They grew up and were like... Well, so I think it's kind of a twofold thing. With their geographical location and ability to trade consistently, they gained wealth and power that the empire was no longer granting them. They had seized themselves. Not even through, like, conquest or anything like that. It was just they naturally, like, wow, we're paying a lot of taxes, and we have just as much money as there. Why are we focusing on this? But I also think it does fall under a religious and cultural region.
Totally.
I think a religious region,
because portion of it.
I think when we were discussing it, there is a deeply steeped religion in these three places.
And they're like more distinctly culturally and religiously different than the other ones were. It's just the other ones were also being pressured physically as well.
And so I think they had the means to separate themselves, but just culturally they just don't believe in the same stuff. Like this central empire probably functioned well and probably had its religions and stuff like that. But I do picture the triplet cities having a very deep cut religion and something that everyone there is very, very adamant about.
I also don't picture them as, like, intending to fight a war necessarily. I think that they were like, guess what, guys? We're done here or whatever. And then the Empire did the
took it personally
and was like, oh, no, you're not. You're coming back over.
Well, they basically said, hey, we're not going to pay you taxes anymore, and we have our own borders. And empires don't like to hear that.
No, exactly. And then so when...
Like, it wasn't hostile. They're like, we're going to fight you. It's just like, look, guys, we're going to separate from you. And then they're like, oh, yeah.
But then they pull the draft, which immediately is
cuts
like
their
the
own
the last straw. So they're like, now we're gonna come take that back. And then call the draft, and then everyone else is like, no, we're actually out also, by the way, and are willing to fight for it. And then the triplet cities kind of more or less got off without actually having to fight, because the other guys did it for them.
Well, this is the thing. The triplet cities said, hey, we're out. The Empire said, no, you're not. I'm big and powerful, and I'm going to make a fight about it. And then turns out they cut themselves off at the knees
just
by doing that. And then they're like, oh, we'll call it a draw.
Yeah, exactly.
That's probably the funniest set of political events I've ever
had. I know, right? Just like...
This Empire just got so
I think it basically just collapsed because of, like, ego. More than anything.
No, that's all it is,
Just people getting fed up of not having, what's, you know, their best interests honored.
Yeah.
And then they're like, I think we want out, and then they immediately implode at the suggestion of it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's incredible. It also makes the Triplet Cities, to me, feel like almost more of a noble nation in the fact that they had the means, which is one thing, but they decided overtly, whereas like it was a necessity for the other side.
Exactly.
And the Triplet Cities' independence, there's still 3 different cities, but their independence almost feels more real than the other. Real's not exactly the right word I'm looking for, but it feels more powerful than the leaving due to necessity rather than leading due to the fact that they were like, again, they moved out from their parents. They're like, nope, I'm good. I'm out of here.
They're both very, very real, but for completely opposite reasons.
Yeah.
One sort of took like the moral high ground, claimed it, and, you know, seized it for themselves. And then the other one paid for it with blood. Yeah. Which I think is definitely very commendable as well.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But for the entire other reason. Yeah, I think that it's pretty interesting seeing that, like, basically both sides of the empire split and became independent and seized their independence for exactly opposite reasons, or by exactly opposite means. Exactly.
Yeah, totally. No, that's really cool. Man, what a history already.
I know, right?
That's so cool. Obviously, we'll have to have to zoom into each and every one of these states. We'll have to figure out how many, and how they're independent from each other. But this has fleshed out the history of it and how it unfolded so good. And so now we're just basically onto the micro, not necessarily micro, but we're onto a much more specific level with these guys. And so they do have a bit of a history. I'm pleased with that. That's awesome.
When you are coming up with things like especially with independence and stuff like that, but conflicts or political drama, just think about what really steamed them up. What caused it? What kind of things were the deep lying issues that eventually got pushed too far? That's what we did. Create a little bit of drama, create a little bit of spice, and watch it explode.
Yep.
Drop some dry ice into a tub.
Yeah. It's been an excellent chat. Thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Hey, welcome to the end card. Thanks for watching the episode. We have a few more comments to go through for today.
All right, so I'm going to take a glance at one here by Quartz Chrysalis again. Yeah, thanks for commenting. So, for the turtle, why not have multiple names? Exonyms and endonyms tend to be completely different. True. Furthermore, it isn't just the name of one thing. It's the name of an island, a nation, a race, a creature, a deity, the resource. A few different phenomenon, it traveling around and raising and lowering the reefs and the coast and the slow sound of its heartbeat. That's dope. I really like the idea of especially the sound of its heartbeat, because it's such a big creature and having such a big heart.
Yeah.
Having some sort of like, they say if you stand on the coast and you put a shell to your ear, you can hear the sound of its heartbeat. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Super cool.
That would be so cool.
Both like just for like the, you know, mythology of, you know, oh, if you listen to the shell, it can do this, and physically actually being able to hear it, because that's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. No, exonyms and endonyms are a really good point, because when you're talking like the people that are living on this turtle are going to have a very, very different name than the people that are in very, very different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of people in different parts of the world are not going to have talked to the other parts of the world about this thing. They're going to have their own names for it. Yeah. Very good point. To keep it brief, I won't mention it here, but I'll reply to your comment with what I was thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, that's, I'm a sucker for multiple names of stuff. Like, I lean into it almost too hard, and it's a lot of stuff you guys haven't even encountered yet in the campaign. But yeah, the Moth Witch, I came up with like I think 5 different names for it. It was like the Mother of Moths, the Moth Witch, we haven't encountered them in so long. I don't remember them all, but I do remember going through them and just like 5 different names, and then another similar sort of thing. 5 different names for it, and because it makes it feel more mythologized.
Yeah. If multiple people around the world have all encountered this thing or have their own thoughts on it, have their own stories about it, it makes it feel so much more lush and thick.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, absolutely. We have another comment from Jim7217. Thank you again for commenting, Jim. Again, in regards to the turtle. Maybe the people on the Dragon Turtle moving island have access to the key ingredient of gunpowder, but do not produce gunpowder themselves. That ingredient has been traded for multiple times, and another landlocked nation that invests in its resources into technology development and has produced the world's first guns. For this reason, the number of guns and gunpowder is strictly limited in the world. Cool idea. It covers the are there guns question. And yeah, I think we were kind of beating around that bush because we were thinking like, oh, it's a resource and it's a weapon, and that's the obvious answer. Although I think we were like making it a separate, more magical thing. But it is realistically the same kind of concept, just a resource to weapon.
Yeah, because my immediate reaction was like, oh, it's some kind of like magical component.
Yeah, totally.
But also we kind of have this same theme of going like magic replacing technology in a lot of different areas.
Totally true.
And I think that'll be kind of a cool way to bridge that gap is if it's both.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great great comment, Jim.
Yeah, interesting thing that we'll keep in mind for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the engagement, because a lot of people have been leaving multiple comments, and it's just really cool to see.
Really cool to see it, and to actually have a chat and have these thoughtful comments to read, as well as the algo. Really helpful for us to get these comments and stuff like that. So we appreciate it for sure. Challenge time. Because of the episode that we were just doing here, I thought it'd be interesting if you're world building along with us at home. Even if you don't necessarily use it in your game or your book, why don't you come up with a conflict real quick like we were just doing? So the kind of things that you want to focus on are like, who is this impacting? Is it two or more parties? Who are the belligerents? Who is a part of this? Who is it impacting? And what are the cultural things that happen because of it? A lot of wars don't necessarily actually have like an end game where one person completely wipes out the other, but a lot of them have very, very long-standing cultural impacts because of that.
Yeah, so definitely great idea. It's not a game of Civ. It's got its tendrils in little bits of everything, and so think of all the different ways it could possibly impact the area around it, even if it wasn't involved in the conflict. It can have wider reaching impacts as well. So consider that, and if you have any ideas, let us know in the comments. So thank you very much.
And if you want to be featured in the next end slate here of an episode, feel free to leave us a comment here or on Instagram, and you can watch us here on YouTube or on Spotify. Thank you very much.
See ya.